Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming along, everyone. My name is Jamie McKenzie. I'm the chair of the SA chapter, the ACRS. Hopefully most of you know who I am. We've got two presenters today, and I think we're going to be pushing time. So I'll just say now, if you do need to leave before we finish, please feel free to sneak out. But I'll keep this very brief. Get it working. If you don't know, the toilets are back out and around, so please, if you need to use the toilets, go for it. I will let the presenters introduce themselves. I think you've had a bio from Rick in the flyer, but if he wants to give any more about himself, he can, and Amit the same. We are broadcasting this as a webinar, so hi to all those people that are online. Please ask any questions in the Q&A. And we'll pass those on to the presenters to get answered, and we'll record it as well. So if anyone needs to send this on to someone, it'll be eventually on the ACRS website. The one thing I did want to point out on here is the Australasian College of Australasian Road Safety Conference is coming up in Christchurch. It is a hybrid conference, so if you can't make it over there, I know it's a long way, please do try and register and log in virtually. It'll be a good event, I think. All right, I will pass over to Rick. Let me figure out the presentations. All right, hopefully that is coming through. Excellent. Over to you, Rick.
Brilliant. Thank you, and fingers crossed the technology delivers what's required. Hopefully people can hear me if you're online. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. The topic is essentially to focus on what we as the LSA do, but I do want to spend a little bit of time just putting some context on why that's relevant from a road safety perspective. I'm not sure how many people are overly familiar with the structures on how we operate. So I will just spend a little bit of time identifying something that I hope you're all familiar with called the SAFE system. I want to talk a little bit about the cost of accidents and the economics that drive some of the things that we do. I want to spend a little bit of time explaining the different models on how CTP and lifetime care schemes work across the Australian jurisdiction, so that you've got a bit of an understanding of how those interact, looking at the comparisons with what happens in other states. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we do here in South Australia to make that work, looking at our service delivery model, and then just finishing up with a little bit about where we're actually at as the LSA as we go forward. So with that in mind, this hopefully is a representation that you will have seen in a whole bunch of different ways, but fundamentally identifies 5 pillars on which the SAFE system is based. And working out from individuals who are affected in road accidents in the centre, primarily that focuses on delivering safe speeds, ensuring that if you can have accidents at lower speed, you take the energy out of those, it is going to result in less harm as a result. Ensuring that the roads and the environment that those accidents occur on are as safe as possible. As much as we can, trying to deliver and design ways that if accidents occur, the outcome from those is not as serious as it would otherwise be. Looking at safer vehicles, how you make sure that the vehicles that people are in are able to protect them as much as possible, and obviously trying as you can over time to build up that inherent safety. And I think we've all recognised some of the massive advances that are being made in vehicle technology over the course of the last few years. Safe people, the road users, whether they're drivers, whether they're passengers, importantly, whether they're vulnerable road users who, rather than being in a vehicle, are on it or around it without that protection, whether they're pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, how those people will behave and how they interact is a critical part of the system. Those are areas that the road safety community as a whole have focused on with quite considerable success over the course of the last couple of decades. No matter which state you look at within Australia, as a whole, the number of people being killed and seriously injured on our roads over the course of the last 25 years has consistently been coming down. There's an argument that says in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a shift in that trend, but we'll have to wait and see where that eventually ends up. But there is no question that you are way safer on the roads today than you were 25 or 30 years ago. Those four key things drive that, but there is a fifth pillar, and that is the issue around post-crash care. And that's a piece that perhaps gets a little less attention and is really where we operate as the Lifetime Support Authority. Ultimately, it's about trying to ensure that the outcomes for people who are injured on the roads are as good as they can be. And there are a number of drivers for that. How quickly you can respond to an accident. Somebody who is in hospital within minutes of the accident is going to get a better outcome than someone who is lying on a desert outback road for a couple of days before they're picked up. The transfer to hospital, whether or not that is on the back of a horse or a camel from the outback, or whether it's in an ambulance with care being provided, makes a difference. I'm being a little facetious, but it's a simple way of just identifying these are crucial things that matter. Identifying the injuries and the treatment, and then focusing on rehabilitation and recovery to ensure that people do recover as best they can from the accident that they've had, is a core focus of that post-crash care. And the last piece I put in there is around compensation entitlements. How do people economically recover from the event that has happened to them, and how do we make that effective? So that's fundamentally where the LSA comes in. The Lifetime Support Authority of South Australia runs the Lifetime Support Scheme, which provides for the planning and funding of reasonable and necessary treatment, care and support for eligible injured people in relation to the injuries they receive in road accidents, and we provide that for the rest of their lives. There's a number of really important things in that that's articulated, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how those interact with pre-existing compensation systems like the CTP scheme that have been around for a lot longer than lifetime care schemes have. What I do want to, first of all, focus on is the economics of post-crash care, and perhaps one of what I see as a slight fallacies around the way the road safety community looks at the issue of economic impact in relation to people injured on the roads. Nearly all of the data that you see around road safety is expressed in terms that might have slightly different words for them, but fundamentally are about killed and seriously injured. And that number is pulled and used as a benchmark to try and assess how people are dealing with. Going to the ARRB website, you can pull out some data. There are various ways that you can try and articulate what the cost of an accident is, but using one of the more widely accepted methods, a human capital cost, the data that they have suggests that the cost for a death on the roads runs to approximately $2.5 million in current terms. The cost for a serious injury runs to about $650,000, and the cost for a minor injury is about $23,000. Now, that in itself, when you multiply it out by the number of people who are killed and seriously injured, adds up to some quite large numbers. But the bit that I want to highlight is that it's actually hiding something that is quite significant. This is the same information portrayed not across three categories, but across four. When you look at the people who are killed, the cost is the same. It's still $2.5 million. When you look at the minor injuries on the right-hand side, the cost is the same. It's $23,000. But if you break down the seriously injured into those that are catastrophically injured who will not recover from their injuries, which are the people that the lifetime care schemes are designed to look after, and the other serious injuries, which in most states and jurisdictions have a definition that relates to hospitalization, usually based around you being in hospital at least overnight or something of that nature. The cost for catastrophic injuries runs to around double that of somebody who's killed. It's about $5 million on a human capital cost. When you strip those out of the serious injuries, you're still left with a cost for the serious injuries around 600,000. But the point that I wanted to highlight is that yellow bar. If you're really trying to deal with the most significant economic impacts in road safety, it's actually trying to find ways to improve the outcomes for people who survive but are not going to recover, because that's where the biggest economic impact is. And so I just wanted to make sure people are conscious of that subtle difference, which does not often get highlighted when you're looking at information around road safety. I said I was going to talk a little bit about the compensation environment and how the various schemes interact. And so this is a bit of a history lesson, but also just a little bit of a legal update on how things work in Australia. I describe that as the motor vehicle accident compensation environment and represented as a circle. That's effectively all the people who get injured on the roads in Australia. You can divide those up into two simple categories: those who are very seriously injured, who will not expect to recover from the injuries they've got, and those who are not so seriously injured, where they will actually expect to recover, whether that's as simple as a small sprain and you're one physio visit and you're away and you're back at work the next day, right through to people who may have multiple orthopedic injuries, but ultimately those bones heal and they will eventually get on with their lives again. Splitting it on those two, I then also want to split it down the middle and say there are two scenarios that can occur from any accident that you're involved in. Either there is someone else at fault or there isn't. If there is someone else at fault, on the left-hand side there, you are looking at the traditional domain of CTP, compulsory third-party insurance, and that's a very straightforward thing. CTP schemes have been around since the early part of the 20th century, and in Australian jurisdictions, every jurisdiction has had one going since about the Second World War. What does it do? It basically deals with what was a social problem. Explain it in very simple terms. When motor cars first came onto the road, they were very expensive. The people who drove them had lots of money. If they inadvertently ran somebody down, they could actually get compensation from that person without too much difficulty because they had deep pockets. Henry Ford spoiled that model, and by the time you got to the 1930s, there were a lot of people driving motor cars who didn't necessarily have deep pockets. If you sued them for the compensation that you felt you were owed when you were injured, you might not actually get a lot. Hence, CTP insurance. We solve the problem by making insurance compulsory. The insurance does not protect you for being injured. It protects the person who caused the injury to guarantee that their pockets are deep enough when you sue them to be able to get something from them. But don't forget, you still technically have to sue them to get your money. So the CTP schemes have been operating in all Australian states for a number of years, but there's been a few shifts over time. What I do want to look at as well, though, is that bit across the top. Lifetime care schemes is a relatively new concept. The longest ones have been running about 15 years or so. SAs has been running since 2014. The most recent ones in Queensland and WA started in 2016. But what that introduced was a concept that instead of giving somebody a lump of money because you've been injured, we actually wanted to deal with the root cause of the problem. You are not going to recover and you will need help for the rest of your life. How do we make sure that you get help for the rest of your life? We set up a scheme that delivers that. And so lifetime care schemes are designed for people who are above that threshold to be able to receive care for the rest of their life as they require from that motor vehicle injury. Importantly, it doesn't matter whether there was somebody else at fault or not. You're seriously injured, you're going to need help anyway. Let's not worry about that aspect. Let's just make sure you get what you need. And hence the advent of statutory schemes which operate in that space, of which the LSA is one. There are some interesting interactions though. Certain states have adopted a different approach to the way that they actually manage their compensation environment and have fully no fault schemes. So in other words, it doesn't matter actually if you were run off the road by somebody else or if you just crashed your own car into a tree, you still get compensation or looked after on a no-fault basis in those jurisdictions. And so that actually can deal with the whole piece. But within South Australia, that bottom right-hand quadrant, if there's no one else at fault and you are not very seriously injured, there isn't any help available, which is the same in a number of other jurisdictions. The other 3/4 are covered. That introduces some interesting concepts along the boundary, because I can explain the rules in very simple terms, but to decide whether there's somebody at fault or not at fault requires you to analyse in detail the accident that happened, and you can get some arguments as to whether there was somebody else at fault. Lawyers get involved in that space, particularly in the CTP scheme, deciding who's in, who's out. You can see if you're in the bottom right-hand corner and you've got a good plaintiff lawyer, there is some benefit to getting him to argue that there was someone else at fault, because you'll start to receive some benefits. But if you look at the horizontal line, is the one I'm more interested in. If you can demonstrate that you are above that line, you go into the environment where you will be able to be looked after for the rest of your life as a result of the injuries you've sustained. Again, if you're in the bottom right-hand corner, being able to demonstrate medically that actually you're above that threshold moves you into an environment where you will get benefits from one where you won't. But you need to look at what happens on the left-hand side as well, because in that space, whether you're above or below the line doesn't dictate whether you will get looked after. What it dictates is how you will get looked after. If you're above the line, you will receive benefits from the LSA for the rest of your life, which is great. If you're below the line, you will receive a payout from the CTP insurer to cover the future costs of that lifetime support. Now, historically, that has been the way that everyone had been treated. And so when you suddenly change the system and say, by the way, you will no longer receive a lump sum for that, you actually start to see some interesting behaviour. Because now all of a sudden, if I'm somewhere in the borderline there, and I've got good cause to want to have a lump sum, I might try and demonstrate that medically I'm not above that line in order to be able to receive a lump sum payment, instead of having to deal with those painful people at the LSA for the rest of my life. So you do get some interesting behaviours, and more importantly, across that line, there is pressure not just for people to get above the line, but also pressure for people to get below the line. And they can come from the same circumstances. So it becomes really, really important to actually be able to navigate that narrow path and be really consistent in how you apply the rules about who's above and who's below, and making sure that you don't have arbitrage between the two schemes. And so working closely with the regulator on CTP, working closely with the insurers, is an important piece to make sure that this works. But I just want you all to understand that there are effectively two separate schemes that interact here. Okay, you can have a lifetime care claim and you can have a CTP claim at the same time, and you'll have to deal with both of those organisations. We need to try and make it as smooth as possible. If I go to jurisdictions around the country, the joys of federation mean that Australia frequently comes up with 8 right answers to the same question. They can't all be the best solution. In fact, technically only one of them can be. But we are absolutely convinced that our own state is right in most instances. Just so you do know, there are a number of models that I've highlighted there. In WA, you have a CTP insurer that is the government. You have a catastrophic care scheme, which is also government underwritten, run by the same organisation. A whole lot easier to deal with some of those issues around the boundaries. If you look at Victoria and Tassie, they both have full no-fault schemes underwritten by the government. And so, again, these issues around who's above and below the line don't necessarily become that critical, because you're going to get looked after by either the TAC or MAIB in Tasmania, no matter what. On the other hand, if you look at SA and Queensland, we have privately underwritten CTP schemes with insurers trying to protect a profit margin, and we have government underwritten lifetime care schemes running alongside that. New South Wales has a slightly different model in that their CTP scheme is privately underwritten, but it's actually a bit of a hybrid model. There are some no-fault benefits, but The balance sheet for their lifetime care is government, and so you do still have those same interactions. The key thing to understand there is that in all cases, anywhere in Australia, there is protection for you if you're injured on the roads. However, it will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So what do we do in SA? I want to talk a little bit about how we go about dealing with stuff. The first thing that we want to do to look after people is to understand that they're injured in the first place. We need to know. And so we try to make sure that we get notified when there are serious accidents. That might come from the hospitals, it might come through the police. It can come through the CTP insurers in some instances. The injured person themselves can identify, or we sometimes hear from a carer or responsible person who identifies. Those first two are the most timely ways of us being notified when the accident happens, and ideally we want to try and capture as many as we can at that point. But knowing that an accident has happened where somebody might be injured doesn't get you into the scheme. We have to have an application process. Those applications come either from the individual or their representative, or alternatively from the insurer. So the CTP insurer can apply on an individual's behalf if they think that they should be in the scheme and instead are trying to pursue a lump sum. So we can get in applications from either the individual themselves or the CTP insurer. Those applications need to be made within 3 years of the accident. Ordinarily, there are a few exceptions on how we can deal with time outside of that. Mostly those people, when they are initially accepted, are accepted as interim participants. And the reason for that is that at the time of application, we often do not know how their injury is going to develop over time and whether in fact they may recover sufficiently not to need our services, or whether they are in fact going to remain in that unrecovered status, or at least with a significant deficit that means they remain in the scheme for life. Once we've got applications through and we accept somebody into the scheme, okay, we have a service delivery model that focuses on how we actually want people to transition over time. Dealing with them as soon as the accident has happened, the acute phase, is very different to what we're doing when we get to what we describe as living life. The acute phase is about dealing with their hospital stay, about the discharge from hospital, identifying where they're going to go and whether or not they need interim accommodation arrangements. It's importantly really focused on rehabilitation, because we have a strong focus on early intervention, rehab, and maximising independence for individuals as a result of this. And there is a strong driver for that from both a social perspective. It is far better for people to be able to live a better life in future rather than wallowing in their injury. But from our perspective, where we have to fund the care that they need for the rest of their lives, if some rehab spend now means that instead of 2 people to get you out of bed and dressed in the morning every day, you only need 1, that will save us a lot of money from the scheme. And so there are economic benefits as well as social benefits from that focus of early rehabilitation. Transition phase is all about moving people back into the community, ideally getting them home, and our primary driver is to have people return to their homes post-injury, to have them set up in a way that they can continue to operate in the community, be around their friends, their social interactions, try and restore what we can of the life that they may have had before, or find substitute activities that will go into that, which provide for a better life and independence for them going forward. Living life is about continuing then to provide those needs for the balance of their lifetime once they've got an established lifestyle going forward. Give you a bit of an idea, we expect people to be in the acute phase anywhere from 12 to 24 months. The transition phase covers another 12 to 24 months depending on the individuals, and really living life phase cuts in at the earliest probably about 3 or 4 years down the track. Although some people can take longer to adapt than that. I do want to focus a little bit on what it is that we're providing, and I'll also give you a bit of data on the types of injuries that we've got coming forward in a minute. But the most significant thing that's on there, if you have a look at that pie chart, that splits out the current future liabilities that exist within the LSA on our balance sheet That's how much the promises we have made to what is, as at 30th of June, 300 people in the scheme will cost us going forward. So those 300 people, not the people who are going to come in the future, those 300 people will cost us, according to our actuaries, $1.35 billion over the remainder of their lives. You can see that 71% of that cost is attributed to attendant care. That's the bit of how much help do I need at home. And it is by far the largest impost that we have. Given what I said before about rehabilitation and focusing on early intervention, if you can see the rehabilitation costs in there, it runs to about 4%. If I have to pay double for rehabilitation, but I get a 10% saving in attendant care, I'm doing the scheme a wonderful favour in terms of the economic impact. I'm also doing those people who no longer are dependent on that care a huge favour. And so that is a critical piece around what we're trying to do and thinking about how we operate and what our objectives are for participants when they come into the scheme. But that just gives you a bit of a feel for the split of the type of spend. As you can see, hospital and medical obviously is what you might expect to be a significant cost, equipment and home modifications to allow people to live at home, and then obviously the cost of running the scheme itself. I want to give you a little bit more detail about who is in the scheme because it helps to understand the type of things that we're dealing with and may actually influence from a road safety perspective where you want to focus. But I talked about people being interim participants. Whilst we in theory take people into our scheme for life, judging whether they actually need to be in the scheme for life is actually quite a hard job, because you've got to try and project what's going to happen over the remainder of their lifetimes, and it's not a simple question to answer. But just to give you a bit of an idea on those components, if you look at the green sector on the top left, those are people who've actually been in the scheme at some point in time or interacted with us by applying, but are no longer in the scheme. So there's the lightest green is actually those that have been accepted but actually have died as a subsequent to that. We've got a number of people that are outstanding that we're still assessing. There are 50 or so people who had applied for the scheme that actually were not sufficiently seriously injured to qualify for the scheme, which I see as a good thing. And we've also got 44 people who had come into the scheme and were accepted as interim participants, but actually by the time we did their lifetime assessment 2 years later, they were no longer in need of staying in the scheme. And so again, I see that as a bit of a success story of getting people back to no longer being dependent on what we do. The red sections though cover the people who are in the scheme. We have 82 people got accepted originally as an interim participant and are still interim participants. We've got 49 people who, when they came in, were automatically accepted as lifetime. Those are generally people for which you do not expect to see any recovery. So, for example, a complete spinal rupture or a amputation. We do not expect limbs to grow back. So there are certain people where you will expect to see people accepted automatically as lifetime. But the majority of people are then accepted as interim and subsequently become lifetime after we've assessed them. And that's the 172 people you can see there. I mentioned before that the application can come either from the insurer or the individual. Just to give you a bit of a split, 74 of those 425 applications that we've had over the life of the scheme have come from insurers. The remainder have come from individuals. And so looking at the 300 people that are currently in the scheme, this just gives you a bit of background as to why they're there. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have one burns victim, we have 47 spinal cord injury participants, we have 48 participants with amputations, but by far the biggest sector you can see, over 200 people, are those with brain injuries. Having a serious car accident ultimately comes down in terms of your recovery to whether or not your brain is injured in a very large way. And that is the biggest driver of people both coming into the scheme and also of the opportunity for us, because how brain injuries respond to treatment is something that has a whole range of variables attached to it. And it does make dealing with people quite significant. But when you're looking at this and you're looking at what are the drivers that bring people into a scheme like ours, the predominant one is that their brain is injured during the crash. That's probably not that surprising when you think about the physical forces that happen. A brain, whilst it's protected by your skull, can rattle around inside there, and you can do all sorts of horrible things to it before you actually then get to see it. Perhaps most importantly, brain injuries are frequently invisible. It's much harder to see your typical brain injured person than it is somebody with a spinal cord injury. Oh, they're in a wheelchair, something must have happened to them. That's obvious. The brain injuries are much harder to identify and deal with and come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. And that's actually the predominant reason why we have interim acceptances, because there are, in fact, good news stories where people who have been quite seriously damaged initially are able to recover enough function that they don't need to be dependent on us going forward. But that just gives you the split in terms of the type of people that we're dealing with. In terms of the status, you can see the majority of people are lifetime. That is those who are still in the scheme. At any point in time, we will have roughly 2 years worth of intake in the interim status, because we do lifetime assessments after 2 years. And we get net around about 40 people a year coming into the scheme, hence there's 80 or so people who are interim at the moment. In 2 years' time, I expect those 80 people all to be part of the lifetime component, but there'll be another 80 or so who are interim who have come in since. And you can see it keeps feeding through, but this section of lifetime will keep growing for many, many years to come. Just to show you a little bit in terms of the people coming into the scheme, in terms of numbers of applications, I mentioned we get around about 50 people a year in South Australia who are injured to a level where they need the support that we provide. That 50 varies to some degree randomly on a year-by-year basis. But if you have a look at the number of people that were accepted in each year, you can see in the first 3 years we were running somewhere between 40 and 50 or so people. In 2018, the number accepted went up because we changed the criteria and actually made it easier for amputees to become part of the scheme. And as a result, we had quite a number of backdated applications. From that point onwards, you see, I mean, when you look at the actual numbers, on average, we have worked out almost exactly where we were expecting it to be. But you do get variations, good years and bad years. 2021 was what I'd describe as a bad year in terms of the number of applications that we received. 2022 was a good one. But neither of them were outside of the realms of what I describe as expected range. And looking at that same information slightly differently, these are the people by the year their accident happened as opposed to by the year they applied. So we did get some applications that were relatively late. And so in 2022, whilst we might have had 37 applications, if you remember the number from the previous graph, 22 of those related to the current year from brain injuries, and we've got another 4 from others. But that's a lot less than the 37. The others were ones from prior years who were late putting their application in, or it was delayed in terms of an assessment over time. But what you can see is you can start to see the build of approaching somewhere around about 40 to 50 or so people per year in the scheme on a regular basis. So I talked about saying approximately we're expected, or rather we are where we expected to be. The actuaries forecast 50 people a year coming into the scheme. They forecast an increasing number of people exiting the scheme at any point. And the number of people that we have in the scheme now is almost exactly where they said it would be. Well done to the actuaries. However, there are a number of variations on that. And one of the things that's significant is actually that the number of people who have died since they came into the scheme is a lot lower than we expected it to be. People have been surviving longer than they are supposed to. And in fact, our valuations were adjusted this year to take account of that trend, that actually people are not being impacted as much as we expected them to be through having serious injuries. On the other hand, we also have had more people leave the scheme as a result of their injuries improving than we expected as a whole. The consequence being the number of people who've left the scheme is roughly where we expected it to be. The reasons why they've left the scheme are slightly different to what we expected them to be. And frankly, both of those are good social outcomes. Less people dying, more people recovering is a great outcome from a social point of view. But we do need to be slightly cautious of what the impact of that might be financially in the longer term. And obviously we want to try and maintain the sustainability for the scheme as we go forward. And I just want to give you some basic numbers from our balance sheet as it stood at 30th of June this year. Importantly, that outstanding liabilities at the top, which I showed you earlier, 1.35 billion, is how much we expect those 300 people to cost us over the remainder of their lives. Add in a few other liabilities and then take off the investment assets that we own, which is a little bit under 1.3 billion. And leaves you with a net equity position of 85 million shortfall in theory, or putting that in a funding ratio, we have 93% of the money that we expect to have to use available to us today. Now, if you are dealing with a very short-term insurance portfolio, that could be a very frightening number, but we don't have to spend that 1.35 billion next year. We only have to spend a small portion of that next year and some of it the year after. And in fact, if you project the cash flows forward like the actuaries do, some of that 1.35 billion won't be spent for another 80 or 90 years. So we do have plenty of opportunity to be able to adjust our capital position to meet that. And that 93% is well within our board's target range of 80 to 120 on a funding ratio position. But it is worth bearing in mind that despite some good investment returns over a period of time, we are still in a position where the amount of money that the fund holds is not quite as much as we think we will need in the long term. Obviously, one of the key things to understand on that, and the question I was asked earlier was, where does that money come from? Well, it's important to understand that money actually comes from you. It comes from every road user in South Australia. When you pay your registration, you pay some money to transport for the registration of the vehicle, you pay some money to a CTP insurer for the CTP portion that I talked about. You also pay an element to the lifetime support for that levy. And that levy money comes direct to us, and we have to try and make sure that the amount we're collecting every year will be sufficient to fund the people who are injured during the course of that year going forward. And that becomes obviously a critical piece for sustainability for these schemes. The longer they run, the more information we have, the easier it becomes to estimate what we think we're going to need. But we are still at a very immature component of our life. We've been going 8 years. At this point, we expect the scheme to reach maturity in around about 50 years from now, with something of the order of 1,500 to 1,800 participants in the scheme. At that point, we still expect to be receiving around about 50 people per year coming into the scheme, but we're expecting 50 people a year to be exiting the scheme as well, and so it will stay roughly in equilibrium until somebody gets to the heart of the road safety issue and starts to reduce that 50 people a year that's coming in. And that's ultimately why I'm looking to the road safety community to say, what can we do to bring that down? When I look at those key messages, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. First one, that post-crash economics needs to focus on what I would consider to be the highest cost element. That's what we deal with on a daily basis. Don't lose those people in the generic numbers that are used around the place. Remember that there is something critically important to focusing on where your highest spend is. Lifetime care schemes as a whole are designed to help improve the outcomes, especially for no-fault parties who might otherwise receive no benefits. But equally, the focus is not on maximising a payout to somebody, it's on maximising the independence for the participant to be able to give them as much of their life back as we can, at the same time benefit the scheme by reducing the ongoing costs. The ultimate objective, though, for the LSA and for somebody who is operating in a scheme that is guaranteed to grow for another 50 years, it might seem an unusual objective, but I would like to be in the position where I put myself out of business. It would be great if there was no need for the lifetime care scheme because people were not being injured on the roads such that they needed this care. And that's where I'm interested in what road safety has to offer, how we're going to deliver on the new strategies that SA has set last year, that the national road strategy has come into play. Are those going to deliver what we're really aiming for, which is to have no people injured or killed on our roads? Any questions?
Just wondering, like, what proportion of serious injuries are catastrophic? Like, just as a general
Okay.
question.
So just for the benefit of those online, I've been asked what proportion of injuries that we receive fall into that catastrophic category. Probably the easiest way to get a perception on that is to look at CTP claims. Now, that doesn't necessarily pick up the people who have been effectively injured by their own fault as opposed to somebody else's, but there are around about 3,000 CTP claims in South Australia each year. There are around about 50 people a year who come into the Lifetime Support Authority. So it's a very small proportion of the total number of people who are injured that represent that very high cost component. Yes.
Is there a predictor or a crash type predictor circumstances that result in the scheme?
The question was, is there a predictor for the crash types and who might come into the scheme? At this point in time, all of our actuarial information is based on statistical data from what's happened in the past. And we can predict what we think is the proportion of particular types of injuries. We can predict roughly the number of people that we will expect. And so far that has proven to be, over the long term, relatively accurate. So our actuaries predicted we would end up at around about 300 participants at this stage of our life. We were on 300 participants at the end of a financial year that's just finished. They predicted that somewhere around about 75% of the people in our scheme would be brain injury participants. And we're sitting at somewhere close to that. I think it's about 71. So that data at a macro level is giving us reasonably good guidance. But on the other hand, that does not remotely look from a scientific point of view as, is a brain injury going to result from this type of crash in this type of location? Or is a spinal cord injury going to come from this type of crash at that speed in this type of place? There isn't anything behind that at this point in time that allows us to be able to say, stop those accidents and you'll stop these type of people coming into our scheme. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Yes, back.
Thanks, Rick Martin Small, immediate past president of the college. A fantastic presentation, like really good. As you know, I actually worked for the New Zealand injury insurer.
Yes.
And I was really pleased when the at-fault stuff was taken out of the equation in South Australia. But I'd be really interested in your views, if you're prepared to expound them, as to whether there are any other meta reforms in South Australia's treatment broadly for sort of good public policy reasons. Any other further reforms for the injury management and insurance scheme in South Australia?
Right. So for the benefit of those online, the question from Martin Small was, do I think there may be any future government interventions or looks at how the system currently works? And I'm going to be a very good public servant and say, it's not my job to respond to that. It is the government of the day. But I will at least espouse from a personal perspective some obvious thoughts. One of the things to remember is that despite the fact that we have 8 different right answers in Australia to the one fundamental question, and there are no doubt inefficiencies in some of those schemes, the way they interact together and the rest of it, The overall premise is that within Australia, if you suffer in a motor vehicle accident, generally speaking, you will be looked after. And the system does work. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I'm quite sure there are myriad opportunities for improving efficiency, eliminating some of the discrepancies and inconsistencies between the way we do things. How much of that will make a fundamental difference to what we're doing? I would argue probably not enormous amounts. When you add up the dollars, yes, it will be big dollars that can be saved potentially. But if you look at it in the totality of the compensation environment in Australia, broadly speaking, if you're going to have a motor vehicle accident, having it here, as opposed to perhaps say in the backwaters of Asia, is an infinitely preferable outcome. Yes.
But extending on that, if I happen to have an accident in the state,
Yes.
different scheme, under which state would I be looked after?
Okay, so the question is, if you have an accident interstate, who looks after you? Just to highlight some of the inconsistencies, that depends whether you have a CTP claim or a lifetime care claim. Lifetime care schemes agreed between all the states cover anybody that has an accident in that state. And it doesn't matter if your vehicle is registered here or registered somewhere else. If the accident is in South Australia, it becomes my problem at the LSS if you qualify for lifetime care. If you have a CTP claim, CTP is attached to the registration of the vehicle, and so it is dependent on which vehicle the at-fault car, sorry, which state the at-fault vehicle was registered in. So if a Victorian car crashes into you here in Adelaide, that claim will go back to the TAC unless there is a lifetime care element to it. So one of those potential opportunities for inconsistency to be improved, who knows? But there are in fact two different answers to the same question there in the current state.
Is there an interplay between the CTP compensation and the NSA? So if an assessment is made 2 years down the track, is it handballed back to the CTP?
Yeah, so the question was whether there's an interaction between CTP and the LSA around what happens if somebody's injury changes over time. The answer is simply yes, there is an interaction. Ideally, what happens is that when you are assessed by us, if you come into our scheme, we pick up the liabilities whilst you're in it. At the end of that period, if you, as an interim assessed, are then concluded not to be a lifetime participant, it is deemed that your injuries do not meet that threshold. That means that if there is someone else at fault, you will have the opportunity to get a CTP claim paid out instead. It's worth remembering, we only provide care and support for the injuries that are incurred for people. We do not provide any compensation for pain and suffering. We do not provide any economic compensation, so lost wages or anything like that. If you have a CTP claim, you're entitled to those benefits, even if you're a member of our scheme. But what you cannot get if you're in our scheme is a lump sum payment for your future care and support, because that's not your liability, it's ours. On the other hand, if it is not our liability because you're not in our scheme, then you are entitled to receive that from the CTP insurer. Ideally, we all use the same information, we use the same benchmarks, and it is very clear where that line lies. Obviously, in practice, you can get medical experts at 20 paces debating who's which side of the line, and we try and minimise the number of times that happens.
Thank you very much, Rick.
Apologise for the
Come on up, Amit. I'll just get all this working. Okay, all yours.
And good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me to the ACRS sessions. I'm Amit Dua, and today I will be giving you an overview of the Blackspot program in South Australia. So my team is responsible for the management of the Blackspot programs, which includes call for nominations, technical assessments, and making recommendations to the federal government. And I'm aware that about 60% of the councils, nearly 2/3 of the councils, haven't nominated a project under the Blackspot program in the last 5 years. So the purpose of me being here today is to hopefully make it easier for you to understand the Blackspot program process. So just as an introduction, I will be providing the strategic context of why we have Blackspot programs. I will give you an overview of the Australian government Blackspot program and show you some typical treatments. And I will then talk about an evaluation undertaken by the department and followed by a brief summary. And all nominated projects under Australian government program and are reviewed and prioritized by DIT. So the South Australian Road Safety Strategy to 2031 is based on a safe system principles and is framed by the guiding vision that no person should be killed or seriously injured on Australian roads. So the strategy presents a 10-year plan to reduce the annual number of deaths and serious injuries on our roads by at least 50% and 30% respectively. So by 2031 in South Australia, we are aiming to have less than 43 fatalities and less than 474 serious injuries. So Blackspot program works towards tackling these targets. Now the target set up in the previous strategy were 80 and 800, like less than 80 fatalities and 800 serious injuries. The new strategy has set up an ambitious target, which we aim to achieve within its stipulated time frame. Now you can see that in the graph, like, you know, in 2021, we had 99 fatalities and pretty much 883 serious injuries, which is more than what we set up, you know, in the strategy target. So the new targets are pretty ambitious and challenging, you know. So what is a black spot? So road locations with a history of fatal and injury crashes over the last 5 years or high potential for crash risk. And it can be proposed by road agencies, councils, member of the public, and organizations such as RA, SARTA, anyone using, you know, crash records and trends or using community concerns for a section of road or intersection. And the benefits of the program, it is a low cost sort of safety improvement to roads with a proven crash history or high risk locations. And it saves community many times the cost of the injury crash, and it's spread across rural and urban areas and is a funding avenue for local government and is 100% funded by Australian government. Now, these are the casualty crash maps what we provided to. So we got a Blackspot website and we provide all the associated information for every LGA, even for department regional areas as well. And these are the casualty crash maps. So they provide an assistant to easily depict the, you know, the crash locations within the road network. And these are the discrete crash maps, which provide assistance again, like, so these purple dots are pretty much like crash locations, which are within 400 meters of each other. So they provide an assistance to, and once someone picked the crash locations from the map, then we provide detailed crash history, detailed crash description to actually pick up and read the description of the crash, like what type of crash and how it eventually happened. So this is all the supporting information what we provide on our website, which is providing assistance in working out the crashes. And the Blackspot criteria itself is, like I said, anyone can actually nominate, and it can be on eligible roads like national highways, state and local roads, and is 100% funded by Australian government. And the funding distribution, what we have is 50-50 for metro and rural areas, and then up to 100% can go to reactive projects. Reactive projects are projects which is having a history of crashes, and proactive projects where there is a risk of crashes. So up to 30% going to go up to towards proactive projects. The maximum cost of a project is 2 million. The minimum is around 20,000. And we need some of the supporting information such as, cost estimates, concept designs, to work out our technical assessments. And some of the ineligible costs such as, purchasing or equipment or cost involved in the preparation of road safety audit reports, maintenance sort of cost sort of thing. And with the criteria, minimum 3 casualty crashes in the last 5 years, and it has to be 0.2 crashes per kilometer per annum over the last 5 years. So in simple terms, if I have to explain you, for a 3 kilometer section, it has to be minimum of 3 crashes. For 4 kilometer section, it has to be a minimum of 4 crashes. And for an intersection location, the minimum crash has to be 3 casualty crashes. So it doesn't include PDO, which is property damage only. And for the development of 23-24 program, we're using the last 5 years, which is from 2017 to 2021 crash period. And the benefit cost ratio has to be a minimum of 2 for reactive projects. And the BCR's, benefit cost ratio can be calculated based on either using Osroad's crash type method or human capital, the bit rate method. And normally for proactive projects, we use risk reduction cost ratio. And proactive projects need to have a road safety audit report to support them. So in simple terms, like I said, a proactive project is often called an accident waiting to happen, and there is a deficiency of some kind, whether that can be side distance, roadside hazards, etc. And councils or even department, for making a proactive project to be as a nomination, they need to have a road safety auditor sort of thing, and most engineering consultancies have them who have this sort of capability. So and then a suitable treatment is then developed to address the risk identified in the audit report, and then we use our road safety risk manager to assess the score. And the timeframes what we have for Blackspot program. So we have already opened it for the last 6 weeks. So it's opened on 15th of July, and the important date is that is closing on 17th of October. So you still have 6 weeks, to submit your nominations for the program. And then internally we do the assessment and prioritization of nominations for the Australian government. These are some of the examples actually for the recently completed project. So one of the examples like South End Access Road, where we did the delineation improvements, audio tactile line marking on edge lines, reflective pavement markers. Another recently where we did a roundabout on Nelson Road and Cassius Road intersection. So this is before and after. And then we recently did barrier highway upgrade north of Riverton, where we did a shoulder ceiling and guard fence. And this is another example of where we have upgraded Victor Harbour Gulwa Road. So we created a left turn offset actually, and was to create it to improve the line of sight from Gulwa Road. So we did a left turn offset. And another example, commonly we do shoulder ceiling and roadside barrier for run-off road crashes, to prevent run-off road crashes, and then mast arm project to reduce rear end type crashes for a better visibility to the road users. And Blackspot also fund level crossing upgrade projects. So this is one of the examples we did at Flinders Ranges Highway, where the line of sight was pretty bad. So we improved that by creating a T intersection. And we did delineation improvements as well. And then, any pedestrian or cycling project can also be a part of the Blackspot program. So this is an example of split pedestrian crossing. Now, DIT undertook an evaluation of the Australian Blackspot program. So we took 2012-13 to 2014-15, and we found that pretty much the casualty crashes at the treatment sites were reduced by 39%. So this is quite actually good, and most effective urban treatment was found to be roundabout, which reduced pretty much 73% casualty crashes. And most of our treatments have actually reduced 20 to 50% crashes. And Seagull, at intersections, we found the least effective treatment on intersections. But no treatment type systematically increase crashes, which is good actually. And in summary, Blackspot program reduce crash risk and trauma in our communities. It provides safer and more forgiving road environments and is a good value for money. So this is our website address. If in Google, if you just type SA Blackspot, it will pop up as the first one. And if you had any questions regarding, please feel free to contact me or Talita. Yeah. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you. Yep.
That's a fun. I think you said in the beginning, Mitchell, that over the last 5 years, no council had.
Yeah, almost 2/3 of the councils hasn't nominated any projects actually under the program.
Does that mean that it have their own group of Blackspot projects that they try to get the funds for, or does that money accumulate, or does it get distributed to the other states and territories, or what happens?
No. So when I said that 2/3 of the councils, it means that we still have like nominations coming, but we haven't received nominations from some rural councils or some metro councils. But every year we normally receive nominations more than what we have funds, like So we're not short of nominations, but what our analysis show that we haven't received. Some councils are not that active compared to the others.
Explain the so, for example, if a council, does that then get assessed by DOT and then they apply for the federal money, or does it all go to the federal system?
So sorry.
Say all the money comes from the Commonwealth.
Yep, all the money is from Commonwealth.
Who assesses?
So we assess, the department assess the do all the technical assessment of the program. Yep.
And then just the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and then we do the prioritization and recommend the program to the federal government for their approval. Yep. Yep.
You mentioned the proactive and reactive projects. Is there much of a distribution between, I guess, whether what gets approved or nominated, especially I guess in relation to proactive versus reactive?
So up to 100% can go to reactive, and because reactive are the locations where we have a history of crashes compared to proactive. So proactive projects can get up to 30% of the funding, of the total funding what we have.
And I guess what is that about what it is at the moment? Is it about 30% to get approved are proactive, or is it?
It depends on the nominations what we receive in an year. Every year is different actually. So some year we receive more reactive. There was one year where we were run out of the projects actually, and we picked pretty much a lot of proactive nominations. So Nelson Kester's, what I have shown you an example, that was a proactive nomination, and that was $1 million roundabout upgrade. So yeah, that's why we always ask that you should not limit yourself, like always go ahead with your nominations. What you need is only a road safety audit report with the proactive nominations with the concept design. So yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Thank you.